David Wilner.
And Barnea Levi Sullivan.
We are back in our virtual studio, and we have a very interesting guest with us who's joining us today. Barnea, who is our guest?
Dr. Erez Ben-Yosef is Associate Professor of Archaeology at the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures in Tel Aviv University. I must say that I've taken several classes with Professor Ben-Yosef, and they were always challenging and difficult. And so know that there's a personal connection. And Professor Ben-Yosef, Erez, it's a pleasure to have you on the LandMinds podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Hi, Barnea. Hi, David. Pleasure to be here.
You're supposed to be in social isolation, and I see you're sitting out at some kind of an excavation. What's going on?
That's the miracle of Zoom. So I can show you some pictures. Behind me is Timna Valley, of course. I'm getting used to this software now, also with teaching online. So it's quite cool.
Right. Professor Rolston was saying that since everything moved online, so the students are helping the professors understand the capabilities of the software so they can work better. Fair. The reason why Professor Ben-Yosef said, of course, is because Timna Valley is his main excavation. But I want to start a moment before that. Lewis Thomas wrote a book called
Sorry, go ahead.
Called Uncle Tungsten. And he talked about this fascination with materials and with metals. And you're the Uncle Tungsten of archaeology here in Israel. You're fascinated by metal. You've been working in archaeological digs that relate to metal. How did this start? What is your interest, and how do you see it connected to archaeology, please?
Well, first, Timna, in Israel, we have one of the best places to study ancient metals, ancient metal production. We have a fantastic place with ancient mines and copper smelting sites that was not destroyed by modern activity, almost not destroyed. And very early on, Professor Benno Rothenberg realized the importance of this place for the study of ancient metallurgy. My own interest started when I was, doing my first degree at the Hebrew University, and I was studying geology and archaeology at the same time. And I find ancient metallurgy as a way to combine these two fascinating fields of geology on the one hand and archaeology on the other. And I think it's quite accepted that since the metal revolution in the 6th millennium B.C., metal has been playing a major role in ancient societies and modern societies, and trying to understand this connection between technology, between metals, and between ancient societies, I think a fascinating topic to study. And we have, as you said, we have our own project going on in Timna. It's not exactly in the backyard because we teach in Tel Aviv, so I think it's the farthest excavation we have. But nevertheless, it's an amazing place with a lot of new discoveries. After some period that we thought we know everything because of the work of Rosenberg and all of his discoveries, we found out that there is much more to be discovered. And this is something that I've been doing since my Ph.D. I was doing at the University of California, San Diego. Then I was working with Professor Tom Levy and Dr. Muhammad Najjar in the ancient copper mines of Feinan on the other side of the border. Then for the postdoc, I was working in Cyprus, in the ancient mines of Cyprus. Then we're working in Israel, in the Timna Valley. And, so it's also many different aspects of the production of metals. My own expertise, as Barnea knows from the classes he was taking with me, is the technology, how they produced copper and other metals during different periods. This is a very interesting question because it's like the high tech of the time. It's one of the most sophisticated technologies that they were using. But of course, the project is dealing also with many other aspects of the ancient society, including the question who they were, right? The big question of King Solomon's mines, yes, no, were these the Edomites' mines, and other aspects of how the society was organized, and how was the trade connection with who, which were the markets for this industry, etc., etc. And I will emphasize again that we have in Timna a record of more than 6,000 years. It's not only the biblical time, it's a long history of production and exploitation of the local ores. And this season, for example, that we finished in February, like we were lucky to finish with the field season before all of this pandemic started. We were starting excavating a third millennium copper production sites. So we extend the time horizon, the scope of time that we are dealing with. And every year we have fascinating new discoveries.
So I won't name the person that I'm quoting. I was in the tour guide refresher course, and he explained his approach. And he said, that goes against Benno Rottenberg. He said, yes, but as long as Benno is alive, I'm not going to say anything. There's respect for the person who laid the groundwork. You know, wait, he doesn't have to have the tsar, the pain of somebody's arguing with me, etc. Can you give an example or two for the general public? What is it that we all thought we knew? We assumed this, and now we see something totally different.
When you visit Timna today, the entire story is related to the new kingdom of Egypt, the Egyptian empire. You get into the park and all of the signs and all of the explanations are related to the story of the new kingdom of Egypt.
What year are we talking about?
Talking about mostly the 13th century BCE to the mid-12th century BCE. So we're talking about 150 years of what Rothenberg thought was intense activity in the valley, and all of the major sites, all of the major smelting sites, with the furnaces, all of the thousands of mines, he attributed to the Egyptians and to their story. And this is because in 69 he found a small temple below Solomon's pillars, the red cliffs that you can see behind me here. And this temple had thousands of artifacts, including some inscriptions with cartouches of pharaohs that we know from Egypt. So based on this discovery and his assumption that only an empire could have managed such a big project, he dated all of the major production sites to this period. Before that, there was kind of Nelson Glick activity in the 1930s. He thought that all of that should be related to the early Iron Age, to the story of King Solomon and the other Judite kings. But Rothenberg took it out of the picture, and this is what we thought we know until 2009, when we started the new excavations. And back then, Rothenberg was still alive. He passed away in 2012 at the age of 98. And he was sharp until his last day. And I started my own project, but I got his blessings. He was very generous when he was older. And he said, you go ahead and do whatever you can with the technologies that you have. And I also shared with him the first results that we got from using radiocarbon. And these results showed clearly that his dating is more complicated than what he thought the situation is. Okay, so we are not changing it completely, but we are showing that the situation of the dates is a bit different. And
okay.
That's fine. But did he know there was 6,000 years worth of work?
Yes, he was aware of actually his main project was not the temple of Hathor or the biblical period. it was part of it because it's the most dominant period in the valley. But he was aware of the ancient history of the valley, and he claimed that this is the oldest place in the world where copper was smelted for the first time. This is not accepted anymore, but of course he was aware of the many thousands of years of history of the valley, and he was actually the one that brought together different experts in order to understand better the technology of metal production. He brought together geologists and physicists and chemists and other people, and this is considered to be the foundation of what we call today archaeometallurgical studies, archaeometallurgical research. So Werner Rothenberg in that regard was a pioneer. And at the beginning, he accepted the early Iron Age dating of Nelson Glick, but then with the discovery of the temple, he was kind of overwhelmed with the ability to pinpoint the dates of different pharaohs. And as I said, to attribute everything to an empire rather than this unknown biblical entity. That it was very popular back then, biblical criticism and staying neutral and not getting into biblical controversies. So it was very easy for him to use his discovery of the temple to say there is nothing here from the period of King Solomon, it's all related to the empire of Egypt. And this was, after a year or two, accepted by everybody, even Nelson Glick and Albright, before they passed away in 71, accepted this dating. The discovery was in 69. And this was it. Everybody was sure that we know everything, all the basic things about Timna. I came to Timna in 2009 as part of my research in Fenan that I mentioned, that I was doing together with Muhammad and Tom Levin, in order, in a way, to compare what we know about the technology from Fenan to what is supposed to be the technology of smelting, of copper production of the New Kingdom of Egypt. But we had a budget for radiocarbon dating, and the results from the lab were shocking to us because there was not a single date that that came from the 13th and early 12th centuries BC.
Where did you take these samples from?
So it's one of the largest smelting sites, which is called Site 30. Timna is not one location. It's a big region of more than 60 square kilometers with dozens of different sites.
Maybe let's clarify that these were not metal samples. We don't do carbon-14 testing on that. What items were tested?
So in the valley, there are 10 smelting camps. And in these camps, there is a waste of furnaces, industrial waste. And within these waste piles, there is first the charcoal, remains of the fuel, but in Timna, we also have a lot of seeds of what they ate. So we have short-lived material that can be dated very precisely. And the first dates came from a site called Site 30, which Rothenberg excavated and published as a New Kingdom Egyptian smelting site. So it was a type site for the New Kingdom Egyptian activity. And after our excavations in 2009, not a single date came back from even the bottommost layers from the New Kingdom Egyptian period. And then we understood that there's this monolithic dating of all of these major sites to the New Kingdom of Egypt has a problem. And since then we started the Tel Aviv project, Tel Aviv University project in 2012. And since then we have excavated many different sites, different contexts in the mines, in the smelting sites. And now we have a much clearer picture regarding the chronology. We don't take away the Egyptian story. Copper smelting in the valley started in significant quantities indeed with the Egyptians. during the 13th century BCE. But we now know that the Egyptians were a minor phase, and the most intense production started actually after they left the region by the local tribes that we believe are the core of the ancient Edomite kingdom. So there is a continuous production in Timna starting at the 13th century and goes all the way to the 9th century BC, almost 500 years. And the most intense production took place during, what can we do, during the time of David and Solomon. So we have, again, under discussion, the question of the connection to the United Monarchy, if there was any at all. It has to be, nobody is arguing about the new dates. I think our new chronological framework is accepted by everybody. The questions are still related to understanding the history and the implication for biblical scholarship of these new discoveries, together with, of course, the discoveries in Feinan, right? This project in the other side of the Araba Valley had similar results. They were first published in 2008, so it's not very, it's quite recent, even the publications from Feinan. And I think that it's now, it takes some time for the scholarly community to
absorb it and rethink it.
Exactly, to absorb it, to rethink it, and to understand the implications of it. And another thing related to the quantities, I think it's just the data, is that it was not local production on an opportunistic basis. It was something big, something well organized. Everything, there was something orchestrating Timna and Feinan on both sides of the Araba Valley. And with quantities that were much beyond local consumption, even for the other neighboring kingdoms. So I was not surprised that a year and a half ago, or something like that, a German team published that the copper in Greece, in Delphi and Olympia from this time period, came from the Araba. For me, it was not a shock. For others, because I've been working in these slag mounds and this quantity of the mines and all of that for many years now, but this is an analytic, direct evidence for copper in Greece coming from this region as early as the 10th century BCE. We have new evidence from Egypt showing that this is not published yet, but we have a collaboration with Shirley Bender-Levin from the Israel Museum about artifacts from the 21st dynasty, the third intermediate period, showing that, again, Egypt was also a market for this copper. It's not a big surprise, again, because Egypt is not so far. And again, the quantities are quite impressive.
Give me a year, please. So, give me a year.
It's the early 10th century BC. It's just before Shishak, the dynasty.
There is a country, Erez, there is a country that is very closely identified with copper production, and that's Cyprus. So can you talk about the interrelationship with what was going on in Cyprus in these early stages, right? And how Cyprus became, even the name Cyprus, right? We identify as having a connection to copper, right?
Right.
What's going on? How did that association shift?
Starting at the early second millennium BCE, Cyprus became the most important copper producer of the ancient Near East. And it was like that for most of the periods. And even in the Roman time, it was a major copper producer. And because of the name of the island, the Latin word for copper became cuprum during this early Roman period, and from that to English, copper. So when we say copper, we immediately can think about Cyprus. There is a connection with the word itself. But the early Iron Age is a very, very unique period in the history of the land of Israel, of or the ancient Near East in general, as I think everybody that is a bit familiar with the ancient Near East knows, because we have a big crisis at the end of the Bronze Age. It's very, there is a lot, hundreds of papers to try and understand this crisis, but nobody argues that there was a major crisis. The main empires of the region collapsed, Egypt included, but all the others as well. And apparently Cyprus also suffered a lot. And it's not only Cyprus itself, it's all of the network of connection, of trade. All of that changed, all of that stopped abruptly. So in the long durée of the different periods of the region, this was an opportunity for the local people in this region to exploit the local ore and to produce them in huge quantities. So in a way, this collapse of Cyprus was one of the major reasons why there was a big production here in this specific period. And actually, we attribute the end of this massive production at the mid or late 9th century BCE, both in Timna and Feinan. We believe that the end of this industry is related to the rekindling of the Cypriot trade. So we are not, the end of this industry is just not very clear to us. What we know that it was rather abrupt, and it is kind of at the same time of the Aramean invasion to the south. The Aramean conquest of Gat is exactly the same time as the cessation, the end of the copper production. So we think there is a connection. Together with Dr. Omer Sergi, we invested in thinking really hard what might be the connection of the Arameans with Cyprus and copper. And we think that maybe one of the main reasons for the destruction of Gat was to stifle this southern copper trade and to gain the monopoly of Cyprus that was much easier for the northern kingdoms to tax and to benefit something from.
Have copper vessels been found in Gat? I understand it's a powerful enough entity that could run such a thing, but have you found actual copper in that city?
Because this is what Aaron Meyer, the excavator of Gat, was telling me the first time we talked about it many years ago, that he doesn't have much unique quantities of copper, but to benefit from the trade, you don't have to have a hoard of metals in unique quantities. Metals are rare. They usually don't preserve. They can be recycled even later on after the destruction of a city. People will collect everything they can. So for a city, for a center to flourish based on copper trade, we won't necessarily expect unique quantities of the metal in the city. We now have quite it's quite accepted that the Negevite sites in the Negev highlands, all of these dozens and dozens of little sites, were directly related to the copper trade, mostly with Egypt. This is the direct route to Egypt, but we don't have any metal ingots or anything like that. So it's all indirect. And this is an excellent point, because people usually are looking for direct evidence for the involvement of Gat or anywhere else in copper trade, but we would not expect to find exceptional quantities of metal, even if the city or this center benefited a lot from this trade. So we have to keep it in mind. I think it makes a lot of sense that, as I said, the quantities and the flourishing of the copper trade in this particular time, that Gat was the most important urban center in the south. I think that the connection is quite obvious. And since we discussed this with the excavators of Gat years ago, they did find important metallurgical workshops, bronze workshops, significant ones. So I think this is kind of a very, it makes a lot of sense to do this kind of reconstruction. And I have to say that, again, we have to understand, we have to rethink many of what we had in mind regarding this specific period, and take into consideration the benefits of the trade that are not necessarily always directly visible in the archaeological record. And I'm getting into the story of Jerusalem, of course, because this is
right. Right. So, and that's a fact. We're definitely going there. I just want to, just a moment beforehand, again, studying now archaeology, I walk around Masada and I say, you see that sign? That's not true. You see that sign? That's not true. So one of your pieces of work was on what was called the Slaves' Hill, which was assumed to be slaves. And you've changed that sign, of the tourist signage. You could talk about that for a minute.
This is the hill behind me, this sandstone hill. It's one of the largest smelting sites in the valley. It's covered with 1,000 tons of slag. This is the black material that you see on the hill itself. And we have to remember, and it's also important, maybe we can talk about that later, that what we have excavated is actually industrial context. It's not the dwelling. We should imagine like a tent, hundreds of tents in the region. And what we have here is the industrial remains. We started excavating here in 2013, and because of its proximity to the temple, the Hathor temple, the Egyptian temple, we thought maybe this is where the Egyptians produced copper, but also here there was nothing from the Egyptian period. It's dated to a narrow window of the late 11th to the 10th centuries BCE. And the name Slaves Hill is after Nelson Glick, who first reported this site. And for him, they chose this elevated hill surrounded by cliffs and a wall was because of the manpower, that for him only slaves could have worked in these harsh conditions. So they built this wall to keep the prisoners, keep the slaves inside, that they won't run away. And this is how we got the name Slaves Hill. Okay.
Which you can understand if you grew up in America and dealt with the Civil War, or you looked at the Romans at the death camps working in mines. Absolutely. It would make sense.
It would make sense, but when I start my explanation, when I have groups of visitors to Timna, I say there is a big confusion between the smelting, the high tech, this magic of working in the furnace, to the mines. These were not the same people. These were not the same, they did not have the same social.
You don't need the professionalism to be a miner. You have to learn, when do you see that color? I want it. That's
exactly.
it.
Exactly. And for mines, we do know it's a simple technology that didn't change much for millennia. And we read in historical descriptions about sending prisoners, and even early Christians. Eusebius tells us about early Christians being sent to the mines in Faino, in Feinan. This is clear, but we have to separate the mines, the miners, from the smelting camps. That's where this magic happened. That was that for sure some religious activities were part of it. Some cultic aspects for smelting was part of it. And as I mentioned, we should really treat it as the high tech of the time. And when we started excavating at Slaves Hill, indeed amazing stuff came out of the ground that we wouldn't expect to find in a slaves camp. Really the best of the best, including food, and the preservation of organic materials in Timna is extraordinary. Maybe Masada is something that is a bit equivalent, but it's from a completely different period. This is the only place in Israel that we have 11th, 10th century organic remains that are not charred, that are not burned. So we have textiles, we have cloth, we have ropes, we have seeds, some fruits with the fruit still attached. And indeed, we have all of the 7 species that are mentioned in the Bible: barley, wheat, olive, pomegranate, all of that, but also almonds and really good stuff. Fish, they ate a lot of fish. Surprisingly, all of the fish on slaves here came from the Mediterranean.
Ah,
This is work, yeah, not from the Red Sea. This is work done with Dr. Omri Lerner and Dr. Lidar Sapir-Chen. We have many different experts working with us on the interpretation of the different remains. And this is quite surprising in a way. On the other hand, seeing these smelters, these metal workers, as part of the elite is not surprising to somebody that comes from archaeometallurgy, from ancient metal production, because we know that even today in traditional societies, like in Africa, societies that still produce iron, the metal workers are considered priests. They are considered part of the elite of the society. So this was quite amazing. And
You mentioned earlier Aaron Mayer, and when we were working in Kayafa, Barnea and I, so we were talking about the 10th century, obviously, and so, right, the way he described the difference between the hillbillies, the Jews in the mountains in the 10th century who had copper or bronze, right, and the Philistines who already had transitioned to iron and were controlling that trade, right, was a very strong contrast in terms of the transition between the period where people depended on tools that were based on copper and the transition to iron tools, which were superior in general.
Yeah, so there are some confusions here, some confusion in several aspects here. You can get into details if you want, but first, iron was not necessarily superior. It was cheaper. It was more accessible. It's called a democratic metal. It's much cheaper, but there are things that you can never produce
with iron.
It was never a complete replacement of copper and not of bronze. You cannot cast iron, not until the Middle Ages, and everything that has to be casted into a mold, you have to do it with bronze. So let's say Babylonian arrowheads were produced from bronze. And of course, everything that has to do with ornaments, symbolic items, covering temple walls, this can be only done with copper. So although iron becomes more and more popular, it would never be a complete replacement of bronze and copper.
But the idea is that weapons, the iron weapons, are generally going to be far superior than bronze weapons or copper-based weapons, which are much softer.
But superior in a way that they are more cheap, that they are cheaper.
And aren't they more solid? Aren't they a better, more durable weapon than a copper or bronze?
Necessarily. No, not necessarily. It depends how you work the iron. Iron in itself is a metal that you need to be, that it has to be, steel, real steel, in order to be better than the bronze. And knowing how to produce real steel took a while. And the other thing that I have to mention here, if you want to go into the details of this fascinating transition into iron, is this kind of the role of the Philistines. So we don't have necessarily direct evidence for what we have from the biblical description that the Philistines were the ones that were producing weapons, and not in the Israelites didn't have this capability. By the way, the biblical description of that doesn't mention iron at all. There is no iron in this story. Assuming that the Philistines brought iron with them is based on their possible connection to the Hittite that had some early iron in their society, and some other aspects. It might be true, it might not. It's more complicated than that. And the other thing that I have to mention here is that I completely changed my mind regarding what Aaron Mayer mentioned as hillybillies. I think that we kind of completely underestimated and missed big time these nomadic people that were not building huge cities and walls, and their ability to organize themselves into some early states, even some strong societies that had a significant impact on the entire region. But usually we as archaeologists cannot see them. And I think that this is a very important point, a methodological issue in biblical archaeology in general. And it's easy to understand if you come from the example of the Araba that we just discussed. Because all of what we see is something that was attributed to empires until quite recently. So it's clear that whoever was doing it was able to organize, these people were able to organize themselves into some kind of a centralized, coordinated society. And the other thing here, and I think this is the most important thing, is that we know about these people only because they were engaged in copper production. In other words, if these early Edomites or early desert tribes were still important, were still working together as a tribal coalition, and if they were engaged in anything else like trade or other things, we wouldn't know about them. We would say there is an occupational gap. There is a gap in the history of the region. If we would see some remains of some wars, we would say maybe there were some Bedouins, some very weak society in the region. So the point here is related to the way we understand these transparent people in biblical archaeology. What we did until now, and I think it was the only way we could go, is to compare them to the Bedouins, right? Because if we have a nomadic component and we can't say much about these nomads based on the archaeological record, we have to resort to ethnography. And the same region, the same area is where the Bedouin of today live. So since the early days of biblical archaeology and even biblical scholarship, every time people were talking about these mobile people, these hillbillies or these tribes of the south, of these early tribes of Israel, we were talking about Bedouins. And Bedouins, imagine the 19th century, early 20th century, Bedouins were considered to be people without law. It was a dangerous land. It was these tribes that were not organized. They were always bickering, fighting with each other. The razzia, all of that instability, all of that was imposed into the archaeological record and the biblical description itself. But what if we're talking about a period where all of that was different, and if we see here an exception in the way tribal societies, tribal mobile societies were able to organize themselves. And what I claim is that what we see in the Araba is this exception. And maybe it is applicable to neighboring polities like the ancient Israelites. So instead of thinking about the nomadic phase of the ancient Israelites as like Bedouin, we might think about this nomadic phase as something like we see in the Araba, as a strong kingdom that is not very visible to us, or not visible to us at all, because they didn't leave behind anything tangible archaeologically. Again, if we do a survey, a very specific, a designated survey to find tents, we might find them. Adam Zartal did a wonderful survey in Samaria, and he was able to locate remains of tents. Then we have the problem of dating these remains, if at all we find them. And if we are lucky, we will be able to say maybe these are early Iron Age remains of a tent. But we can never, or almost never, be able to go from these remains to the social structure of these people. To say if they are indeed like the Bedouin, or Genghis Khan on the other hand. I'm just giving an extreme example here just to make the point. But maybe it's correct that during most of the periods, these mobile people were like the Bedouins of today. But if we don't think out of the box, we will miss these exceptions of these mobile groups creating strong polities that had a very significant historical impact. And I think this is a very important lesson from the excavations in the Araba. And again, maybe it's because I'm like almost 20 years working in the slag, in the sun, so I have some imagination. But really, if you follow carefully about the history of research in the Araba, you understand that until not long ago, everybody accepted that the same remains, thousands of mines, hundreds of thousands of tons of slag. All of these are related to empires. Now we have a different dates that we don't have empires in the background, and we have to assume that it was the local tribes that were behind this sophisticated organization of labor and this kind of coordination of trade and industry all over the Arab.
So let me just ask a tangential question. You said that the state of preservation of the finds that you have there, the rope and the cloth, can we culturally identify the people that were working there in the 10th century?
Well, we don't have any inscriptions, unfortunately, not in Timna and not in Fainan. And I mentioned earlier that we believe that the easiest explanation will be to identify these people with the early Edomites. And I think if we think about if we just...
That just because of proximity? Is that because Edom is close by?
No, so,
what is that based on?
Okay. Well, coming into this research, being a student, and then watching all of this change in the history of research from the Egyptians in the south, the Assyrians in the north, now to the 10th century tribal society, you understand that there is a lot of biases in the research that we have to clarify before we get into the main conclusions. And one of them is that Edom was on the Jordanian plateau. So it's true that later on in the late Iron Age, we have the Edomites with their capital in Bosra on the Edomite plateau. But if we read the Egyptian texts, the Assyrian texts, and the Bible itself regarding Edom, Edom is in the Araba for sure, and it's also in the southern Negev. Solomon builds a port in Elat, in the land of Edom. It's clear, it's there. If you read the boundaries between Judah and Edom, it's somewhere in the northern Negev. So this region, according to not only the Bible, is the heart of the Edomites. Later on, when their most important economic resource became trade, they established their settled sites in the eastern in southern Jordan of today. Bosra is situated on a main junction between the King's Highway and the road that goes down to Hatzeva. But prior to that period, there is no reason to assume that the heart of Edom was in the southern Jordanian plateau. So this region, according to the Bible and non-biblical sources, can be attributed to Edom. And if we want to say, who are these people, and not rely on the Bible at all, we still suggest that these are the early Edomites because we have early documents in Egypt talking about Edomites and the land of Edom in this region already in the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. Okay, so we know about people called Edomites in this region quite early. And for sure, the land was called Edom. Some part of the land somewhere was called Edom and Seir, which are kind of probably similar names for the same region. But more than that, in the late 9th century, we have evidence from Assyria about the Edomite people in this region. So according to us, it's the people, the scholars that excavate in this region. So that Tom's team and others that work on the early Iron Age, and suggest that to see in this activity the early Edomites. We believe that this is the easiest explanation for this population that later on established settled cities in the Jordanian plateau.
Good.
I will just summarize the point about the Edomites. I think that we're talking about trying to identify these people working in Timna and Finan in the 11th, 10th, 9th centuries BCE. Who were they? So I think that the attempts to sound neutral and call these people the desert polity, like Finkelstein does, or the Tel Massos chiefdom, which is completely not related, because Tel Massos has nothing to do with the people of the south regarding material culture and anything else. Tel Massos was an important road station with this regional trade system, but not related to the control of these people. So I believe that trying to be neutral, meaning not use something that can sound a biblical affiliation, creates more trouble when we try to explain what was going on there in the 9th century BC. Because as I said, during the late 9th, we already hear about the Edomite from the Assyrians. And then during the 8th century, there is this emergence of a few cities in the Jordanian plateau. So if we call them anything else rather than Edomites, we will need to explain how the Edomites got into the system, how they replaced these people that were active in copper production, it's new tribes coming to the region and live and mixing. Any other thing that rather than calling them the early Edomites, if you want, you can call them the proto-Edomites, will produce more complications in the interpretation of the history of the 9th, 8th, 7th centuries BCE. So in this case, we think it's easier to affiliate these people with the Edomites than to affiliate these sites of the Iron One in the hill country with the ancient Israelites that everybody accepts. In the hill country, we have nothing to affiliate this population with the ancient Israelites rather than the Bible or projecting from later periods. Here, we even on a safer ground regarding this affiliation. But as you know, Barnea and David probably you know very well that this is a debated issue. I'm coming from this, what I just said, that I think it will be more complicated if we call them something else and then suddenly have the Edomites coming from nowhere and you know, getting into the historical picture. So this is the reason why we suggest that what we see in front of us is the emergence of the Edomite kingdom, and that the Edomite kingdom was a tribal nomadic kingdom early on, something like the 11th century BC, and where you know, can be named, can be described as a kingdom in the Bible, even without being sedentarized, even without being based on settled people. This is another thing that there is no basis for, even in biblical scholarship, that we think all the time about kingdoms in the Bible or kings related only to settled population. This is something that is really rooted in biblical scholarship, which we think there is no real reason to accept, especially now that the evidence of the Araba is kind of an eye-opener. Like now we can think about other ways of these nomad people rather than always being these Bedouins on the margin of society, on the margins of history. Okay, that's related to this methodological, you know, thinking or rethinking about these methodological issues related to the nomads of the time.
I'd like to make a few points that it's been building up. So first of all, ladies and gentlemen, this is brought to you by the same man who, together with Leder Sapir Chaim, says we don't see camels, and they made an uproar about the Bible and camels. You see here an intellectual honesty. Second of all, we won't be able to get to already in this interview, but Professor Ben-Yosef's scientific work, it's not just carbon-14 or the applications of carbon-14. When he goes through a slag heap, you go through a slag heap that's sometimes hundreds of years, and you see the difference in the effectivity of the production. And he recently put out an article about calcium. And when you learn about smelting, you learn about flux, you learn how can I make the process happen with less fuel? How can I trace the improvements of technology? And then the carbon-14 can date that. But you have a pile, one on top of another. It's an incredible, unique archaeological gift, these slag heaps. And then Professor Ben-Yosef is talking about our modern constant mistake of superimposing our values or our assumptions. What is a city? A city is, even with the 10 rules of city that scholars came up with, maybe that's not what the Bible means by city. And maybe a king doesn't have to have a capital and a palace and all the trappings of power, because it's a different type of kingdom. Go watch Lawrence of Arabia. By the way, when I watched it with my mother in the movie theater, she said, "Oh, they made a mistake. He put his left hand into the pot of the masa. You never use your left hand." She got the mistake, right? But understanding what things meant then is wrong. Next, in a paper I did for Professor Ben-Yosef, I changed my understanding of what the Bible means by Edom. Look at the boundaries of Judah. The moment you go south of Judah, it's already Edom. Ignore the boundaries between Israel and Jordan today, right? And may peace flourish and they'll again disappear. And you're talking about a vast area whose head may be Botzra, but you're talking about loosely connected. Well, we all know that we're connected. You know, there's 3 different Arab families that are in the southern Hebron Hills. They know very clearly where they are. They have what they call inheritances, which are apparently from about 1,300 to 1,400 years ago. They were very upset that the Israeli government put Arafat in charge of them because they had their own hierarchy. You didn't do the work to understand how they were. It looked to you like everything was normal and simple. It wasn't. There was a developed hierarchy. There's a relationship. And so when we're talking about kingdoms, whatever, you're making assumptions which may not be right. And then, as you are now applying that to, quote, the great 10th century debate, unquote, but you also have a particular a suggestion which came out this past July, whatever, that you're addressing now, but I'd like you to highlight it on it. There's a concept called the High Court of Archaeology. Yeah, can archaeology determine whether something was there or was not there? And so you're saying that if not for the fact that they were involved with something which leaves such traces as copper production, we wouldn't even have seen them, especially nomadic people, etc. But you use this as a springboard to discuss the dangers and of making assumptions between archaeology and the world of the Bible in general. And because your finds are within what, may I mention, in academic circles, it's considered the time of David and Solomon. In Jewish circles, it's younger. It's 2,800 plus years old. But we'll stay within the migrash, the framework of the academic world. So you're seeing something that's very powerful and very organized at that time, which was not expected. Can you talk more about this interface between the game changer here and the new understanding?
Are you calling for a response?
Yes. Can you talk more about how you feel that there's the interface between archaeology and the Bible, the mistakes that we're making, absence of evidence? You're touching on those issues. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I think it's becoming clear when you understand that the biblical narrative is talking about nomads. And if the biblical narrative was talking about, urban society, city-states doing that or doing that, I would have said, archaeology can contribute a lot. archaeology can of a city with destruction layers, with waste piles, can tell us, can give us some information about the social organization, about the way people reacted with each other. This is archaeology from a certain type that can get us some information about the way people were behaving in the past. But the biblical story itself, the biblical narrative is talking about nomadic tribes, about the nomadic origin, not only of the Israelites, but also of the neighboring kingdoms, including the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Moabites. And if you understand that this is a core component of the biblical story about nomadic tribes getting together, creating strong coalitions, creating kingdoms, creating something substantial, then you understand very well that archaeology has to be very modest about its ability to go back from the archaeological record to the biblical narrative and judge, as you mentioned, the high court, judge if this narrative or that narrative was a real history or not. I think that the case of the Araba, it teaches us about being more modest and being very careful not to rely only on the Bedouin model, what I call the Bedouin model, like meaning that everything that is nomadic and not seen to us has to be interpreted as a Bedouin society, something that is, as I said, on the margin of the strong societies and kingdoms. This is something that is, if we come with this notion back to the biblical text or back to archaeology, a whole lot of different interpretations become available to you. And I think you said also you mentioned an important point, which is that we have to be very careful about our biases. Including the understanding the term Ir or city, right? It's the translation into city, and even a Hebrew speaker that reads Ir in the Bible first thinks about Ir, about I don't know, the Gordon Child's city definition of a walled place with lots of population. But if you go to the etymology of the word city, and check it against I'm not a biblical scholar, I'm not a philologist, I'm consulting with my colleagues, and when we go to the text and we try to think about the Ir in descriptions of yearly events, there is no justification to think that it is even a settled site. Ir can be referred to a place where tents are concentrated. So we have to be extremely careful regarding previous assumptions that we have, or preconceptions, or the modern conceptions that we have today about nomads and about terms and concepts that we read in the Bible. One of an example for that and how intricate all of that kind of things is the treatment of nomads in the translation of ancient Near Eastern texts. And there are major archives like the archive in Mari, there are documents in Egypt talking about the Shasu, the nomads, and in modern scholarship, but it goes back to the 18th and 19th century as well, but also today, when a scholar in France and anywhere else try to translate from the Akkadian the word for nomads, he or she will use Bedouin. And you read the translation, and if you are, just a regular scholar, the interpretation of these nomads as Bedouins is kind of imposed on you, because they were not using, we are not using the French word for nomads or the English words nomads. In the official translation of these documents, we are using Bedouins. I just read an example from Papyrus Harris the first, from the period of Ramesses III. Again, every time there is nomad people, the translator used the word Bedouin.
Fascinating, fascinating.
So it doesn't give us even the option to consider other possibilities. Right. And it goes for many, many different directions. I think that, and I would say something about the emergence of ancient Israel and the ancient Edomites that happened at the same time, more or less. We are talking about a very unique period in the longue durée of the region, in the history of the region. After the Bronze Age crisis, the Egyptian hegemony that was on the land of Canaan for a few hundred of years completely disappears. There is a very unique period, a vacuum, a political vacuum in the entire region. The city-states, like that they were protected under the Egyptians, right? If you remember the stories in the Amarna letters, how the Shasu or the Apiru attacking the cities and they cry for help from from Egypt.
Stop Labayu. Stop Labayu of Shem. He's not right. Yes.
Labayu of Shem, Abed-Hepe. There is no more Egypt in the background. This is exactly the period for these marginal societies, for these nomadic people to gain power as they never could have had before or after. If we try to find an exceptional period for nomadic tribes to create a coalition and to create something strong, this is the period. Even the new evidence that this crisis is related to climate change and to severe droughts goes together with the marginal societies having a big benefit to cope with desertification of regions, to go from a place to place, to live in nomadic life. This is time that they had the advantage over the settled people. And it's not just because that we see here the time where people of nomadic origin created something very significant.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. In other words, if you say that the late Bronze Age collapse happens because of overbuilding the cities and taking the resources towards the empire without letting the locals develop property, so you're saying not only do I not have the empire extracting everything so I can focus on myself, there's even a greater advantage to the nomadic peoples over the sedentary peoples because they can adapt. You know, in the back of my mind, everybody's looking, God forbid, what would happen if there was, my Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg once said, can you imagine the world without electricity? Like, how would you function? Right? But can you conceive that that's possible, that there won't be electricity? So we had somebody, Micha Chanun, come into our prehistory class in Tel Aviv, and he showed us how to make rocks and how to start fire and how to do all these things. Right now, can I go outside and get food? Can I go outside and get fuel? Can I go outside and take skins of animals and make them into either a tent to live in or into clothing? Can I preserve? I don't have a fridge. I don't have a refrigerator. Can I preserve things? Can I manage on my own? Those who have those survival skills will have a tremendous advantage over those who are dependent on urban society bringing everything in them. And that highlights also that metal, if I'm going to have a professional that's all they know, they need to have their food brought to them so they can just do the special thing. So I, the empire, am going to supply you with all the needs. And if there's no empire, then not. And now what you're saying is, no, switch that around. I'm local, I'm nomadic, I know how to do this, we'll handle it, we'll use the resources of our whole area, but don't expect to find great cities wherever. That's not how we live. But we're interconnected. And like the Romans said, Mare Nostrum, the sea is not a boundary, it's not an obstacle, it's our way of communication. We live the desert. We know the ways, we know the water, etc. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. Who needs those Syrians or anybody else? We have a wonderful life right here.
I think you gave some good examples for this, exactly what I'm talking about. The need to rethink a bit this dichotomy or this perception of nomads, of having the nomads always being the weak societies, the unruly, the ones without law, without organization. This period is a specific time in history where they had the opportunity to benefit a lot from organizing themselves into something that is substantial, that can be, in fact, related to some sort of an early state. If we go back to the example of the Araba Valley, that, as I mentioned, until recently was interpreted as imperial activity, and we now give the same level of social organization to the tribes, to the nomadic tribes, we have to rethink about the way nomadic people could have organized themselves in this specific time period. And again, the implications to biblical archaeology is significant, because when we start to interact with the text, we have to remember that the text itself, the narrative in its basis, is talking about tribes with nomadic origin. And I do think, for example, that the Iron Age 1 little sites that we see in the hill country and we interpret as Israelites or proto-Israelites, I think that this is just a fragment of a much bigger picture of specific cases where they had to build something for defense, like, like the site of Gilo with the tower, for cult, like the site of the Atarapar, the site of the how do you call it in English? Atarapar,
the place of the offering to the bull god, to the Ashur god, Ami Mazar, right?
The bull with the bull figurine. This is a cultic. So what we see is just kind of a specific cases in which this nomadic population became visible to us, but it's not the entire story. And also, we have to take into consideration the possibility that much of the population was still nomadic even in the 10th century BCE. There is no reason, not from the biblical text and not otherwise, to assume that with the creation of the monarchy, everybody was settled. It's a continuum. It's a long process. And another misconception, or kind of a modern projection into the past, is the idea that a nomad, in the minute he will have the chance to settle, he will do that.
No,
right?
You see today, the Bedouins did not want to go into the cities. They had to be forced.
He had a tent house in front of his house. It's not only a matter of having more convenient life. For a nomad to be stuck in a stone brick will be not convenient necessarily. It takes a long time to change between the different, I'm talking about generations, not a year or two. If we take the biblical narrative as is, for example, Joshua conquest of the land, we wouldn't assume that everybody would settle down in cities and stone-built houses right in the minute after they have the land to themselves. And let alone if we take the archaeological interpretation of this period of a long process of settlement with east-west direction of movement of people, or without this movement, it doesn't matter. I think that it's like not emphasized enough or at all the fact that what we see is just a tiny fragment from a population that was mostly nomadic. And I think that there is no reason, actually we have some archaeological support for the observation that says that during the 10th century, most of the people were still dwelling in tents. So then it won't help to continue and looking for dramatic walls and big cities in order to to prove or disprove the historicity of the United Monarchy. I think that there is kind of a simplistic way that archaeologists conduct interpretation of the archaeological record vis-a-vis the biblical descriptions. I think it's a bit simplistic, and it's again coming mostly from the lesson of the Araba, and which is very, very strong. I just do a small imagination exercise and think about these people of, you can call them the Edomites, you can call them the desert people, it doesn't really matter, the desert polity. Some kind of polity, the story, Edom or not Edom, doesn't matter to this methodological question. So I try to imagine that this desert polity was organized. The tribes of the southern Araba communicated with those of the northern Araba, and there was one king even controlling all of that in order for everybody to be stable, to live in peace and to thrive. But their main economic resource was trade, an early Arabian trade, or even agricultural product that was uniquely grown in Edom. It doesn't matter. Us as archaeologists would never be able to say something about these people without any documents. We would say there is nothing there, or in the case we find that there are tents or something like that, which is rare, we would say, maybe some Bedouins were here in this early period, nothing significant. You see, the lesson that comes from the archaeological record of the Araba is very important when you understand that everything we see, the textile that I mentioned, the fish, everything that we know about comes from industrial waste and the scars of the mines in the mountains. This is something unique. This is something that is just by chance that we have it. It's kind of a window into a nomadic societies, a society that we usually don't have, not only in biblical time, ever. In world archaeology, it's a unique case where nomadic people left behind something that can tell us something about their social organization. And when we look into it, in this particular period, it's clear that they were hierarchic. They had like different levels of social status within the society, and they were well organized. It's not just because that Rothenberg, in the minute he found a temple, it was easy for him to attribute all of these mines to the empire, to the Egyptian empire. It's because the archaeological record is telling us that something serious was taking place there. Somebody had to make all of these hundreds of people work in the mines. They won't do it just for themselves. It's like much more than a household scale. It's huge scale. Somebody had to make it happen, and the same way that we use to interpret this as the New Kingdom of Egypt, we can apply now to the early nomadic tribal kingdom of Edom, or of the desert polity, if you don't want to use Edom. And the bottom line here is that we have to rethink the role of nomads in this particular time, especially, which is, as I mentioned, a unique time in the history of the land, where these marginal people could have created strong political structures and impact everything around them.
Well, it's a lot of food for thought. For those of you who may have missed it, some of the archaeological criticism of the book of Joshua's account, which should have happened in Jewish tradition 3,350 years ago, is we don't find about 200 of the cities that are mentioned there. But what does it mean we don't find the cities? It means we don't find structures like we're expecting to find cities. But when you have a place that tribes know, we get to this hill, this is where we come together on a regular basis, or it's that point, rethink cities altogether. That question can disappear. Very, very fascinating. Really, thank you for your time. Can you just mention, from your perspective now, what the point that you made about being modest, from my experience, there's a constant challenge. The Talmud says, we learn from Moshe, Lamed lashoncha lomar eni yodei Hashem et titbadeh. You have to teach your tongue to say, I don't know, right? That's a very big challenge for an archaeologist, because we walk around with a certain respect, or the archaeologist says, etc., and the news goes out. So the demand for modesty is a call well taken. Can you suggest what the field of archaeology, from your perspective, could use? What's missing? What could be added? What is a path that you would suggest to follow?
The field of archaeology in Israel or in general?
Open question.
Open questions. For me, the dream really is to have open borders. You didn't mention that it has to be feasible, what you, the ideas that I have, but if everything would have been feasible, I think for the archaeology of this region and beyond, having open borders is really important in many ways. Of course, first is the exchange of knowledge between archaeologists in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Syria is crucial.
Lebanon.
But this can be done in many, through international conference and things like that, that we can still talk to each other. What I mean more is the opportunity to investigate in places that I think are crucial for the archaeology of our region, but are terra incognita in regard to what we know. And I see it especially in my research in Timna, which is kind of in an area that connected between, you mentioned the north, Philistia, maybe Jerusalem, but we have strong evidence that it was strongly connected to the south. The so-called Midianite pottery, the Kuwaya painted well, and technological achievements, and many other things that we believe would be understood much better if we will be able to explore by surveys, by excavations, places like in the Sinai, the eastern desert of Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a huge, huge region that is only recently become more and more accessible to Western archaeologists, or to archaeology in general. And there is so much to do, and from the little that was already done, we know it's gonna be very important to understand many of the social historical processes that we see in our region. So this is my dream, and I think it will be beneficial for everybody to have more research in these black holes, south and southeast of our region. And again,
so if you had an invitation,
archaeology in particular, we know that a lot of things are related to this region.
So Erez, if you had an invitation from the Saudi government to come and excavate in Saudi Arabia, you would jump on it.
I'm coming tomorrow.
All right. Very good. So I want to thank you for the time that you gave us today. There's so much more that we'd love to talk with you about, including some of the things that you have written. Unfortunately, there isn't enough time today to do that because each of those things deserves its own focus and attention. So on behalf of Barnea and myself, thank you for being on the LandMinds podcast today. This is David Wilner.
And Barnea Levi-Sullivan.
We've been sitting with Erez Ben-Yosef. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful Passover in seclusion.
Everybody, have a nice Passover.